uniformed court officer placed a thick manila service packet on the polished mahogany table. The envelope carried a civil court stamp and a receipt showing it had been formally served. It did not belong to the probate settlement we had just finished signing. My hands went cold. I laced my fingers together beneath the table to hide the tremor in my knuckles. I am Patrick Vale. I am 54 years old, and until August of 2023, I ran the daily operations of Vale Memorial Group. Now I sat across from my stepmother, Constance, the woman who had been married to my father for 14 years. She wore a tailored black mourning dress that probably cost more than my first car. A quiet, satisfied smile rested on her face. Leah Bennett, my attorney, leaned close enough for me to hear the leather of her chair creak. "You do not have to do this," she whispered. "We can still walk away and fight." I kept my eyes on Constance. Give it all to her. I picked up the heavy brass pen and signed the final page of the settlement and stock transfer agreement. I surrendered my inherited shares, my remaining claims against the estate, and my right to challenge the transfer. Constance smiled wider. She signed the acceptance forms and ratified the sworn disclosure appendix she had voluntarily agreed to as a condition of receiving my blocking shares. Then the court officer placed the civil service packet in front of her lawyer. The attorney opened it. Inside were an asset preservation order, notice of an emergency receivership hearing, and a copied page from a faded red ledger. His eyes moved across the name Evergreen Memorial Supply. Then they stopped on a massive unauthorized withdrawal and the handwritten notes beside it. He looked back at the disclosure appendix, where Constance had sworn that she held no hidden interest in any company vendor. The blood drained from his face. 3 weeks earlier, I had not even known that red ledger existed. The smell of those lilies brought me right back to the beginning. 3 weeks before the hearing, the cloying scent of embalming fluid masked the smell of autumn air inside the Vale Memorial Chapel. It was early October, the kind of humid Georgia day that made your clothes stick to your skin. I walked into the chapel I used to manage, stepping onto the familiar burgundy carpets. I had been banished for 3 long years. The staff members I had hired and trained actively avoided looking at me. Some of them offered quick, pitying nods, while others glared at me from across the room. Constance had spent 36 months quietly telling everyone in Savannah that I had embezzled from our family business. She stood by my father's casket, greeting the local politicians and wealthy clients. Constance played the perfect, tragic widow. I heard her telling a city councilman that Arthur had died of a broken heart, all because of his greedy son. My jaw tightened. My teeth ground together so hard my temples ached, but I kept my mouth shut. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a public screaming match. I did not want to turn my father's funeral into a cheap spectacle. I stepped back toward the side hallway. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a young administrative assistant hurrying down the corridor. She was clutching a thick, heavy book with a faded red cover. The spine was peeling, and the corners were bent. The girl ducked into Constance's private office, threw the deadbolt, and pulled the blinds shut. At the time, I assumed it was just an old service log they needed to archive. I could not have been more wrong. When the crowd finally thinned, I approached the casket. Arthur looked small, his face powdered and painted by strangers. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out his gold pocket watch. The metal was cold against my palm. The ticking sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room, a harsh metallic rhythm that felt entirely out of place among the dead. I moved to place it inside his suit jacket, right over his heart, just as we had discussed years ago. A hand grabbed my wrist. Constance stepped in front of me, blocking the casket. "He does not want anything from you going into the ground with him," Constance said. Her voice was a soft, venomous whisper, calibrated so only the family row could hear her. I looked down at her manicured fingers digging into my sleeve. I remembered the last thing my father ever said to me before he threw me out of the building. He told me I always saw betrayal because I needed someone to blame. Samuel, an embalmer who had worked for our family for 40 years, took a step forward. He opened his mouth to defend me. Constance simply turned her head and gave him a flat, empty stare. The old man stopped, swallowed hard, and lowered his gaze to the floor. I felt my chest cave in. I was a grown man, yet I felt like a child again, standing in my father's shadow, waiting for a defense that would never arrive. I did not argue. I pulled my arm away and shoved the cold watch back into my own pocket. 3 days later, the real battle began. We sat in the stuffy conference room of the estate lawyer's office downtown. The air conditioner rattled against the window pane, struggling to fight off the relentless Georgia heat. The preliminary will split the assets directly down the middle. Constance received the primary mansion and temporary voting rights for the business. I received enough shares to secure a blocking minority, meaning they could not liquidate or sell the company without my explicit written consent. Constance did not even wait for the lawyer to finish reading. She folded her hands on the table. I want the estate. I want the business. All of it. She turned her head slowly and looked right at me. She stated, in a perfectly level tone, that if I contested her claim, she would unseal the internal shortfall records. She promised to show the world exactly what I did, to cause the company to bleed money. I knew the records were entirely fabricated. I knew I had never stolen a single dime. But I also knew Arthur had signed my termination papers 3 years ago, effectively endorsing her lie. Leah grabbed my elbow and pulled me out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us. She told me we could fight this aggressive move on grounds of undue influence and defamation. We had a strong case, and we could drag Constance through discovery for years. I stood there and stared at the geometric pattern on the carpet. I had spent 3 years paying the price for a crime I did not commit, and now she wanted the rest of my life. I gave Leah no answer. We turned to leave the building. An unfamiliar attorney stepped out of a side office and blocked our path. He introduced himself as an escrow lawyer. He held out a small, crisp white envelope with my name typed on the front. He explained that Arthur had left it with his firm, along with incredibly strict instructions for its delivery. I ripped the heavy paper open. A small brass key fell out and landed directly in my palm. It felt heavy for its size. There was a single piece of my father's personalized stationery folded neatly inside. The note contained only 2 sentences. Do not fight her for what she stole. Make her claim it. At the bottom of the page, written in my father's jagged cursive, was Leah Bennett's full name. I turned and looked at my lawyer. Leah let out a long, exhausted sigh. She admitted that Arthur had come to her office in secret 6 months ago. He had hired her under a completely separate agreement. She was bound by his legal instructions, and she could only reveal the pieces of his plan when certain conditions were met. The first condition was agonizing. I had to listen to Constance's buyout offer completely, without giving away that Arthur had left me any documents. I crushed the note in my fist. I thought it was just another one of Arthur's sick control games from beyond the grave, pulling my strings even when his heart had stopped beating. Constance did not wait long to make her final move. She drove to my rented house early the next morning. She walked right into my small living room without taking off her designer coat. The woman dropped a thick settlement agreement onto my scratched coffee table. Constance offered me a pitiful, insulting sum of money. In exchange, I had to completely surrender my shares, my family title, and any future claims to Vale Memorial Group. She paced across my worn rug, telling me that Arthur chose her because I was too weak for the industry. I did not understand that the dead were a highly profitable business. I leaned back against my sofa. I asked her why she needed my signature so badly, and why she was in such a terrible rush. Constance paused, and a genuine smile finally touched her lips. The truth slipped out. A massive corporate conglomerate from out of state wanted to buy Vale Memorial Group. It was a multi-million-dollar deal, but she could not sell the empire if I held those blocking shares. She leaned over my coffee table, bringing her face inches from mine. Your father's name will survive, Patrick. Yours does not have to. I forced my breathing to stay even. I refused to sign the papers right then, but I kept the copy exactly as Leah had instructed me to do. That same afternoon, I drove to Leah's office and walked straight into her private suite. She took the small brass key from my hand without saying a single word. She walked over to a steel wall safe, hidden behind a heavy oak bookshelf, inserted the key, and turned it. The heavy door clicked open with a loud mechanical snap. Leah reached inside the dark steel box and pulled out a single photograph. It was a picture of a page from that thick red ledger I had seen the assistant carrying at the funeral. I looked closely at the image. My stomach dropped. At the bottom of the page, right next to a massive, unauthorized withdrawal of trust funds, were 3 words written in bright blue ink. PV. Approved. I stood completely frozen, staring at my own initials. My father had not left me a hidden inheritance, and he had not left me a simple apology. He had left me a massive financial crime, completely wrapped in a frame job with my initials stamped right on it. Leah explained the photograph was not legal proof of anything. I stared at the harsh blue ink on the printed image until my vision blurred. The edges of the paper began to curl under my sweating palms. Those letters were supposed to be my initials, but the loops were entirely wrong. I recognized the sharp, aggressive slant immediately. It was Constance's shorthand, deliberately mimicking my signature. Anger flared hot in my chest, a physical burning sensation behind my ribs. I pushed my heavy leather chair back, ready to drive straight down to the chapel and tear her immaculate office apart. I wanted to stand in the middle of the lobby and scream the truth until someone listened. Leah caught my arm before I could stand. My attorney warned me that touching the original ledger would destroy the chain of custody. Arthur had specifically ordered me to stay away from the physical book. Leah finally revealed that the real ledger sat inside an independent legal vault across town. It had been sealed and cataloged by a specialized firm weeks before my father took his last breath. Relief washed over me, closely followed by a bitter, suffocating resentment. The old man had spent his final months preparing this elaborate puzzle, building a quiet case from the shadows, yet he never once picked up the phone to apologize to me. He trusted his lawyer with the truth, but let his son live with the shame. The sight of that forged approval dragged me violently back to August of 2023. It was a suffocating Tuesday afternoon, the air conditioner struggling against the brutal Savannah heat. I had walked into the accounting department after finding 3 massive vendor prepayments that did not match our incoming inventory. The math simply did not work. I asked our controller, Eleanor Shaw, to explain the missing funds. The woman refused to meet my eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled her spreadsheets and muttered about delayed shipments. 10 minutes later, I was standing in Arthur's executive suite. The room smelled of expensive cigar smoke and floor wax. Constance stood right behind his heavy mahogany chair, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder. She softly accused me of sabotaging the financial records to force my father into early retirement. Arthur reached into his desk drawer and threw an internal report onto the glass table between us. The document listed 4 unauthorized wire transfers. My electronic approval stamp sat squarely at the bottom of the page. I begged him to call an independent auditor. I pleaded with him to look at the raw data. Arthur refused. He told me a public scandal would destroy our family legacy and ruin our standing in the community. My father looked me dead in the eye and said that if I could not trust this family, I had no place in his business. I packed my office that same afternoon, completely unaware that Constance had simply hijacked my old electronic signature template to authorize the theft. 3 years later, Constance was still aggressively controlling the narrative. A local Savannah newspaper published a glowing, full-page article about her brave leadership following the family tragedy. The journalist made a subtle, pointed reference to a disgruntled heir who was causing unnecessary stress for the grieving widow. The article described her as a pillar of strength, a devoted wife carrying the torch for her late husband. My phone began ringing by noon. Aunts and cousins called to lecture me. They demanded I drop any disputes and let Arthur rest in peace. Their voices dripped with that quiet, polite Southern judgment, telling me to keep family matters private. They spoke as if I had already stolen the silver from the dining room. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to a voicemail from my uncle. I realized then exactly what my stepmother was doing. Constance wanted me to lose my temper. She needed me to scream, to threaten her publicly, to file frivolous lawsuits without evidence. That erratic behavior would perfectly validate the unstable, greedy image she had painted of me. If I attacked her now, the community would rally to protect the poor widow. I turned my phone on silent, placed it in a desk drawer, and walked away. I would not give her the explosive reaction she desperately craved. We needed to look past the family drama and find the actual money. Later that week, Leah pulled a thick, dog-eared file from Arthur's hidden package. She slid a standard pre-need funeral contract across her pristine desk, tapping her fingernail against the final total. A woman named Irene Brooks and her husband had paid for their final arrangements in full, nearly 10 years ago. They had bought peace of mind, securing a modest plot and a simple service so their children would not have to worry. When Irene's husband passed away last month, Vale Memorial Group had demanded nearly the entire sum a second time. The company claimed the original funds were insufficient due to inflation, completely ignoring the locked terms of the trust. Leah permitted me to visit the widow, strictly as a private citizen asking questions, absolutely not as a company representative. I drove out to a modest, aging neighborhood on the edge of town. Irene welcomed me into a small kitchen that smelled heavily of old coffee and lemon soap. She was a frail woman, her hair pure white, but her spine remained perfectly straight. Irene opened a tin box and placed a faded, yellowed receipt on the table between us. Her voice did not shake as she explained that she had to borrow money from her youngest daughter just to get her husband into the ground. A cold, heavy weight settled in my stomach. A simple accounting adjustment on Constance's spreadsheet had become a profound, devastating humiliation for this grieving woman. Irene did not care who inherited the Granvale estate or who sat in the executive chair. She tapped a wrinkled, arthritic finger against the old paper receipt. "Where did my husband's money go?" she asked. Irene's receipt contained a curious internal routing code printed near the bottom margin. A significant portion of her supposed outstanding balance had been directed to a company called Evergreen Memorial Supply. I had managed the vendor relationships for 2 decades. I knew every casket builder, embalming chemical provider, and floral arranger on the East Coast. Evergreen was not one of them. Leah pulled the public corporate registration records on her computer. She did not hack any systems or cross any legal lines to find the information. Everything was hiding in plain sight on the state website. The state documents showed Evergreen was registered to a commercial mailbox rental store tucked inside a decaying strip mall. The owner, listed on the operating agreement, was Constance's cousin from out of state, a man who worked as a gym teacher and knew absolutely nothing about the funeral industry. More importantly, the company had been formally incorporated just 3 months after my father fired me. That specific timeline was a massive, undeniable piece of the puzzle. It completely shattered Constance's public claim that I had established the fraudulent vendor during my tenure. My name was nowhere near those incorporation documents, and I was already barred from the property when the account opened. My phone buzzed against the hard surface of Leah's conference table. I looked at the glowing screen and saw a text message from an unregistered phone number. The message was brief. "Stop asking about Evergreen. You will make it worse for the families." I recognized the cautious, terrified tone instantly. It had to be Eleanor Shaw. She was the only person besides Constance who fully understood those specific routing codes and internal vendor names. I started to type a rapid response, demanding to know what she had done. Leah reached across the table, snatched the phone out of my hand, and firmly shook her head. We could not afford to spook a potential witness by coming on too strong. An hour passed in absolute, agonizing silence. The law office felt entirely too small. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique wall clock echoed in my ears, counting down seconds we did not have to waste. I paced the length of the room, tracing the pattern of the rug with my shoes, wondering if the sender had panicked and thrown the phone into the river. Then, the phone screen lit up again in the darkened room, casting a pale glow across the polished wood. A second message arrived from the same blank number. "Your father waited too long. Do not make the same mistake." My breath caught in my throat. Whoever was holding that phone knew that Arthur had launched a secret investigation before his heart finally failed. They knew my father had discovered the missing funds. A third message followed almost immediately. It was an image file. I tapped the screen with a shaking finger and opened a photograph of another page from the red ledger. At the top of the handwritten column was Irene Brooks's full name. Beneath her account number was a harsh note, written in dark, smeared ink. "Paid twice. Delay service until balance clears." A final text message popped up right below the horrible image. I wrote that line because she made me. Leah drove us away from the historic district, leaving the shaded cobblestone streets behind. We parked outside a drab, unpainted brick building wedged near the industrial park. The exhaust from a nearby factory left a bitter, metallic taste in the heavy, humid air. I followed my attorney up a narrow flight of concrete stairs. My shoes scraped loudly against the grit on the steps. Miriam Price did not look like a typical corporate auditor. She wore a bright, yellow blazer and possessed a sharp, calculating energy that filled the small space. Her office contained no family photos, no decorative plants, and no warmth. The glass desk held nothing except 3 blank sheets of printer paper and a thick black marker. Miriam offered no polite small talk, simply confirming Arthur had retained her services 6 months ago in total secrecy. I asked for the full investigative package. The accountant refused. She stated the regulatory agencies were currently reviewing the raw data, and any interference could ruin the ongoing case. Instead of handing me a file, she uncapped the marker. She drew a crude, dark circle on the first sheet of paper. "Trust account," Miriam said. She dragged the heavy tip to the second sheet, drawing another circle. The marker squeaked against the paper. "Operating account." A final, bold line connected to the third sheet of paper. "The shell vendor." Miriam explained that Constance did not just skim random handfuls of cash from the register. My stepmother operated a deliberate, highly structured financial machine. The forensic accountant estimated the initial missing funds exceeded $3 million, though her team was still finding hidden ledgers. Miriam slid the 3 pieces of paper across the smooth glass desk, lining them up perfectly. She tapped the first circle with her fingernail. She explained exactly how the massive theft managed to stay hidden through annual state reviews. Money from brand new funeral contracts flowed backward to cover the actual physical expenses of the people who had purchased their burial plans a decade ago. It was a classic, brutal structure. As long as fresh revenue kept pouring into the building, the accounting system looked perfectly healthy to anyone glancing at the top line. A cold realization washed over my skin. I remembered Constance launching a massive, aggressive marketing campaign for pre-need packages shortly after she took over daily operations. The local Savannah business journals had praised her brilliant, innovative approach to securing future clients. I stared at the crude ink arrows on the desk. That celebrated marketing campaign was nothing but a desperate mechanism to drag fresh money into a dying system. She needed new, unsuspecting families to pay for the ones she had already robbed. Later that afternoon, Leah arranged a quiet meeting with 2 other families Irene Brooks had contacted. We met in a corner booth at a diner just outside the city limits, far away from anyone who might recognize my face. The air smelled of burnt coffee and fried potatoes. A retired mechanic sat across from me, twisting a cheap paper napkin into tight frayed knots. His hands were heavily calloused, permanently stained with dark motor oil. His mother had paid for a solid oak casket years ago, wanting a dignified resting place. On the day of her burial, Vale Memorial provided a cheap veneer box. The man described how the thin wood warped and buckled slightly in the humid Georgia air before the crew even lowered it into the dirt. He tried to complain to the staff, but the front desk dismissed him, claiming sudden supply chain issues had forced a necessary substitution. The second family arrived 30 minutes later. A young schoolteacher slid into the vinyl booth, gripping her ceramic mug so hard her knuckles turned white. She quietly explained that her father's ashes were currently sitting on a metal shelf in Constance's back holding room. The accounting system showed a completely fabricated balance due, demanding an extra $2,000 for processing fees that never existed in the original contract. The facility refused to release the heavy brass urn until the fake debt was settled in full. She had been visiting a cardboard box in a storage closet for 3 weeks. I pulled a small leather notebook from my chest pocket. I wrote their names down, pressing my pen firmly into the page until the dark ink bled through the paper. I promised them nothing. Offering them false hope would be just as cruel as keeping their money. Returning to Leah's office felt like walking into a sterile tomb. The air conditioning hummed a low drone, isolating us from the street below. I had confirmed Evergreen's existence, meeting the second condition of my father's strange posthumous game. The attorney booted up a secured laptop and turned the screen toward me. Arthur appeared on the monitor. The recording quality was poor, casting harsh, digital shadows across his face. He looked incredibly frail, his skin hanging loose around his jawline. His breathing sounded shallow and labored through the small computer speakers. My father admitted he had received Irene's desperate letter months ago. He confessed to throwing it in his desk drawer, locking the wood, and convincing himself the grieving widow simply misunderstood her complex contract. When he finally audited the accounts late at night, the digital trail led directly back to his own wife. The old man on the screen did not ask for forgiveness. He stared into the camera with hollow eyes. I taught her that the family name mattered more than the families we served. His voice cracked on the final word, and the screen faded to black. I shoved my chair backward. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. My chest tightened with a sudden, violent anger. Arthur was still pulling strings, manipulating the narrative from a wooden box in the ground. I demanded Leah export the video file immediately. I wanted to send it to every news station in Savannah by tomorrow morning. I wanted Constance dragged out of her mansion before noon, forced to explain the empty accounts to the local news cameras. Miriam stepped between me and the laptop. The accountant folded her arms, her bright yellow blazer acting as a physical barrier. She warned that going public would tip Constance off instantly. My stepmother would immediately wire the remaining liquid funds to offshore accounts and completely collapse the company before the pending funerals could be performed. Leah placed a hand on my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. The victims needed a secure shield before we burned the fortress down. A sudden, explosive revenge would only create a massive crater of collateral damage. I stood by the window, watching the Savannah traffic crawl by, and forced my breathing to slow down. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Miriam pulled a fresh financial summary from her leather briefcase. She pointed a manicured finger at a highlighted row near the bottom of the page. The thick paper rustled loudly in the quiet office. It was a contract belonging to Samuel, the elderly embalmer who had tried to defend me beside my father's casket. His wife was currently in hospice care, given only a few weeks to live. The trust account meant to cover her final arrangements held absolutely nothing. The balance read 0. If Vale Memorial denied Samuel service, the loyal employee would uncover the entire betrayal right in the middle of his deepest grief. I reached for my back pocket, pulling out my wallet. I offered to cover the cost out of my personal savings, ready to write a check that very second. Leah immediately shut the idea down. Masking the shortfall with my own money would simply make me complicit in covering up the crime. She warned me that replacing stolen funds privately would turn me into a second version of my father, protecting the brand instead of exposing the rot. We agreed to quietly secure an independent funeral home across the county to handle Samuel's needs as an emergency charitable grant. We would make sure a rigid paper trail proved it was not a quiet company payout. Miriam tapped the glowing screen of her tablet, pulling up a new, terrifying spreadsheet. Row after row of names scrolled past. The names of the dead, and the names of the people left behind to pay the price. "We have 147 contracts," Miriam said. The quiet authority in her voice made the number sound even more devastating. She looked up from the screen, meeting my eyes. "And someone accessed the archived digital files just last night." Miriam's phone buzzed on the glass desk, a sharp mechanical vibration that broke the heavy silence in her office. She read the screen, and her bright yellow blazer shifted as she leaned forward. The regulatory agency had just received an automated alert. Someone using an administrative login was opening deeply buried financial archives. Arthur had quietly installed a legal backup tracker on the server 6 months ago, and the trap was finally springing. Constance was hunting for whatever copies my father had made, desperately searching the old network drives. My hands gripped the edge of the desk. I wanted to drive straight to the chapel, kick the heavy oak doors open, and rip the computer out of the wall. Leah placed a hand on my wrist, anchoring me to the present. The attorney spoke in a low, absolute tone, forbidding me from going near the property or warning the staff. One wrong move, one angry confrontation, would give my stepmother the exact excuse she needed to cry harassment and file a restraining order. We needed to see the ghost company with our own eyes. Leah drove us to a decaying commercial center on the edge of the county line. The pavement was cracked, choked with dry weeds, and the air smelled heavily of exhaust from the nearby interstate. Evergreen Memorial Supply did not have a warehouse or a fleet of delivery trucks. The massive vendor that drained $3 million from grieving families was nothing but a tiny brass mailbox inside a fluorescent-lit shipping store. The teenage clerk blew a pink bubble, entirely indifferent to the millions of dollars moving through her tiny storefront. We did not break in. We did not bribe the tired worker chewing gum behind the counter. Leah simply showed her credentials and asked about their forwarding policies. The clerk confirmed that all mail for that specific box was forwarded weekly to a private residential address, which she could not reveal without a legal subpoena. I looked down at the plastic sorting bin near the register. A familiar stack of glossy pamphlets sat right on top. They were Vale Memorial Group marketing brochures, the exact same ones Constance used to sell pre-need funeral packages. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. The predator was using our own materials to feed the shell company. Later that evening, Miriam confirmed that Evergreen submitted invoices charging us for transport trucks and massive storage facilities that simply did not exist. The retaliation arrived the very next morning. A courier dropped a thick envelope on my front porch. The paper was heavy, expensive, and carried the seal of a high-priced corporate law firm. I tore the flap open, ripping the thick parchment. It was a formal cease and desist order. Constance accused me of aggressively harassing her staff and actively attempting to devalue the company right before a pending corporate sale. She demanded I stop contacting past clients immediately. The threat itself was standard legal bullying, but the attached exhibit made the air leave my lungs. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull and painful rhythm. It was a photocopy of an old internal audit report. The document officially blamed me for the unauthorized transfers, and right at the bottom sat my father's genuine, undeniable signature. Arthur had signed a document legally framing his own son. The ink strokes were perfect, bearing none of the hesitation of a forgery. My father had chosen the comfort of a lie over the truth of my innocence. Leah sat across from me in my small kitchen, reading the pages carefully. She set the document down and folded her hands. My attorney stated clearly that we had to address this report head-on. We could not pretend Arthur was a flawless martyr anymore. My phone rang before I could process the betrayal. Eleanor Shaw, our former controller, finally agreed to meet us. She chose a crowded, noisy coffee shop in the center of the historic district, terrified of being seen alone with me. The scent of roasted beans and burnt milk hung heavy in the air. Eleanor sat in a corner booth, gripping a paper cup so tightly the cardboard buckled. She looked 10 years older than I remembered. Deep shadows bruised the skin under her eyes. The woman confessed to sending the anonymous text messages. She explained that Constance initially claimed the strange vendor payments were just short-term loans to cover temporary payroll gaps. When Eleanor finally realized the massive scale of the theft, she was already drowning in it. She had physically changed the transaction codes in the system under direct orders. Eleanor did not bring any original files to the coffee shop. She only corroborated what Arthur had already gathered in his secret package. My blood ran cold when she mentioned the forged approval template. Constance had explicitly ordered her to copy my old electronic initials onto the new transfers. I slammed my hand onto the small table, rattling the ceramic plates. I demanded to know why she let them throw me out of the building. Eleanor flinched, pulling her coat tighter around her narrow shoulders. "Your father wanted a quiet answer," Eleanor said. She gave him one. The justification tasted like ash in my mouth. Leah leaned across the small table, her voice dropping to a clinical, piercing whisper. She asked Eleanor if she was the person digging through the digital archives late last night. The controller nodded slowly. Eleanor claimed she logged in to see exactly which historical files Constance was preparing to delete. The problem was entirely physical. Eleanor could not prove her intentions because the security cameras pointing at the archive server had been conveniently disconnected. I looked at the terrified woman sitting across from me. I did not know whether to believe she was a desperate whistleblower or a cornered accomplice trying to build a lifeboat. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. Eleanor finally reached into her purse and pulled out a business card belonging to her own defense attorney. She offered to sit down formally with the regulatory investigators and provide a sworn proffer. The accountant was willing to risk total prosecution and potentially her own freedom to tear the corrupted system down. Constance did not wait for the regulators to knock. She weaponized our family grief instead. She organized a lavish memorial reception for Arthur at the most exclusive country club in Savannah. The invitations went out to every wealthy client and local politician, completely excluding me. My uncle called me that afternoon, his voice dripping with condescension. He warned me to stay away, claiming Constance had shown the family undeniable proof that I was actively trying to steal from the estate. I put on my best dark suit anyway. I did not drive to the country club to throw glass or scream at the widow. I walked through the heavy oak doors holding Arthur's gold pocket watch. The ballroom smelled of expensive champagne and roasted meats. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light across the wealthy crowd. Dozens of conversations stopped the second my shoes hit the polished hardwood floor. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt impossibly thin. The soft clinking of silverware against expensive china ceased entirely. Constance stood near a massive portrait of my father, holding a crystal flute. She wore an immaculate black dress, playing the grieving protector perfectly. She stepped forward, raising her voice just enough so the city council members and wealthy investors could hear every word. She publicly called me a disgrace, promising to protect Arthur's legacy from his own greedy son. The room held its collective breath. I stopped 10 feet away from her. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I looked at the woman who had stolen my father, my career, and the life savings of 147 families. Then why are you trying to sell his legacy before the flowers on his grave even die? I asked. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The wealthy crowd shifted uncomfortably, exchanging confused glances. Constance lost her perfect composure for one single, glorious fraction of a second. Her jaw tightened, and the muscles in her neck strained, before she forced the tragic widow mask back into place. I placed the gold pocket watch on the memorial guestbook table, turned around, and walked out the front doors. The satisfaction of that quiet victory lasted exactly 20 minutes. I was driving back toward the city limits when Leah's phone rang through the car speakers. It was Eleanor. The controller was crying, her breath hitching uncontrollably in her throat. Constance had just called a panicked emergency meeting. My stepmother had ordered all physical paper records pulled from the basement archive immediately. A commercial document destruction company was scheduled to back their shredding trucks up to the chapel loading dock first thing tomorrow morning. Leah did not let Eleanor finish explaining before she called the regulatory enforcement attorney handling Arthur's whistleblower package. She placed the phone on speaker and repeated Constance's order exactly. Every box in the basement archive was scheduled to be loaded into commercial shredding trucks at 8 the following morning. The attorney asked Eleanor whether the destruction order existed in writing. Eleanor said Constance had sent it through the company email system. That changed everything. The regulators already possessed Arthur's preliminary audit, the archived access alert, Irene Brooks's contract, and records connecting Evergreen Memorial Supply to Constance's cousin. The new email created an immediate risk that relevant evidence would be destroyed. Leah and the enforcement attorney worked through the night. They did not call a friendly judge or demand that the police storm the funeral home. They prepared a narrow emergency petition, supported by sworn declarations from Miriam, Eleanor, and the independent company preserving Arthur's server backups. A civil judge reviewed the documents shortly before dawn. He issued a temporary preservation order prohibiting Vale Memorial Group, Constance, and every company vendor from destroying, altering, moving, or concealing financial records connected to prepaid funeral accounts. The order did not declare anyone guilty. It simply froze the evidence in place. At 7:45 that morning, 2 commercial shredding trucks turned into the loading area behind Vale Memorial Chapel. A civil process server arrived minutes ahead of them and delivered the signed order to the facility manager. The trucks were turned away before a single box crossed the loading dock. I was not there. Leah made me remain in her office, because any appearance at the building could be twisted into interference or intimidation. I stood beside her window, looking down at the waking city while she received updates by phone. I had never felt more useless. But for once, my anger did not determine the outcome. The law did. By midday, an independent records team had cataloged the basement archive. Every box received a number. Every cabinet was photographed before it was opened. The digital servers were copied using forensic procedures that preserved the original data. Constance could challenge the order later, but she could no longer quietly erase the past. That afternoon, Leah drove me to an independent legal storage facility across town. The building had no polished lobby or family portraits. It was a windowless concrete structure with cameras above every door. An evidence custodian met us inside a small viewing room. Before touching anything, she read the item number aloud and showed us the original intake receipt. Arthur had delivered the package 6 weeks before his death, in the presence of Leah and a second witness. The seal number on the receipt matched the seal on the evidence bag. Only then did the custodian open it. The red ledger looked smaller than I expected. Its cover was faded and stained along one edge by a pale chemical mark. The spine had begun to separate from the pages. It could have passed for an ordinary service log from any funeral home in the country. Miriam stood on the other side of the table, wearing white evidence gloves. "This book does not prove the entire case," she warned. "It tells us where to look." She opened the first photographed page without touching the original paper. The earliest suspicious entries were dated in 2017. Each row contained a contract number, a withdrawal amount, a vendor code, and a short, handwritten instruction. Some entries carried my copied initials. Others included abbreviations Eleanor had already begun explaining to investigators. Miriam placed an authenticated bank record beside one entry. The amount matched. She placed an evergreen invoice beside another. That amount matched too. The ledger was not a magical confession. It was an index connecting names, dates, bank transfers, false invoices, and real families. I stared at the blue letters that pretended to be mine. "Why did my father make me wait?" I asked. Leah looked toward the evidence custodian. The woman resealed the ledger, recorded the new seal number, and removed it from the room. Only after the original was secured again did Leah open her laptop. Arthur appeared on the screen. He was thinner than in the first recording. A blanket covered his legs, and each breath seemed to require a decision. There was no dramatic music, only the faint hum of an air conditioner and the occasional ticking of a clock. Arthur said he had married Constance 14 years earlier. At first, she had seemed to understand the part of him that feared losing control. She protected his reputation, managed his social obligations, and slowly convinced him that anyone questioning her was questioning him, including me. He admitted that when I raised concerns in August of 2023, he had not examined the raw data. He had accepted the internal report Constance placed in front of him. He had signed my termination documents because dismissing one angry son felt easier than admitting his wife might be stealing from the dead. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to keep watching. Arthur said Irene's letter finally made denial impossible. Even then, his first instinct had not been justice. He had spent 6 weeks trying to calculate whether he could sell personal real estate and quietly refill the missing accounts. Miriam had refused to help him. She told him that replacing stolen money in secret would not repair the crime. It would make him part of the concealment. "I wanted to save the Vale name," Arthur said. Miriam made me understand that the name was the problem. He explained that Constance had spent years denying she controlled the prepaid trusts. Whenever a question arose, she blamed Eleanor, me, or Arthur himself. If confronted too soon, she would continue claiming she was only an uninformed spouse following instructions. Arthur could not order a probate judge to investigate company vendors. He could not create a criminal conviction from his grave. The most he could leave behind was preserved evidence and an opportunity. He instructed Leah to negotiate any transfer of my blocking shares through a private settlement and stock transfer agreement. If I chose to surrender those shares, I could require Constance to sign a sworn beneficial interest disclosure as a condition of the transfer. The disclosure would not be a standard probate form. It would be my contractual condition. Constance could refuse it. She could walk away, leave my shares untouched, and fight me through ordinary litigation. But Arthur believed her need to own everything would overpower her caution. The appendix would require her to identify any financial interest in company vendors, shell entities, or businesses receiving prepaid trust money. Telling the truth would expose Evergreen. Lying would place another signed document beside the bank records. Arthur looked directly into the camera. "Do not do this for me," he said. "I believed her, because believing her protected my pride. Whatever happens to my name is mine to answer for." The recording ended. I sat in silence, listening to the laptop fan slow down. For 3 years, I had imagined my father discovering the truth and instantly understanding what he had done to me. The reality was uglier. Even after he found the stolen money, he had tried to protect the company before protecting the families. He had only chosen disclosure after every quiet escape route closed. Leah slid a draft agreement across the table. The disclosure appendix was attached at the back. Its language was plain. Before receiving my shares, Constance had to state under oath that she had disclosed every beneficial interest she held in any vendor or entity connected to Vale Memorial Group. I asked whether that made the plan entrapment. No, Leah said. No one is forcing her to lie. She can disclose Evergreen. She can refuse the agreement. Or she can sign a false statement because she wants your shares more than she wants to tell the truth. I looked at the transfer page. If I signed, I would lose my inheritance. The mansion was already going to Constance under the preliminary distribution, but my blocking shares and remaining estate claims were real. There was no secret clause promising to return them after the investigation. There was no guarantee the company would survive. Arthur had left me a choice, not a reward. My first instinct was to reject the entire plan. I did not want to obey another instruction from a man who had controlled my life while alive and arranged my decisions after death. Then, Irene called. Another family had been told their prepaid balance was missing. They were sitting beside a hospital bed, trying to decide whether they could afford to honor their mother's final wishes. I listened to Irene explain the situation. She never mentioned Arthur. She never asked whether I would inherit the company. She asked whether the family would have to pay twice. That was when the decision stopped belonging to my father. I called Constance, with Leah beside me. I told her I would surrender my shares and remaining claims if she accepted every attached condition. I described the disclosure as protection for both sides before she pursued the corporate sale. She remained silent for several seconds. Then, she laughed softly. "You still need paperwork to feel important," she said. She agreed. Her attorneys reviewed the agreement that afternoon. They objected to several provisions, but did not remove the beneficial interest appendix. Constance believed the request was a final attempt to preserve my dignity before surrendering. She was so certain that I knew nothing about Evergreen that she saw no danger in the word none. Late that night, Leah received the signed and notarized disclosure. We gathered in her conference room while Miriam placed the appendix beside the public corporate records for Evergreen Memorial Supply. Under the section asking Constance to identify all related vendors and beneficial interests, she had written a known. Miriam looked at the signature, then at the banking chart spread across the table. "Tomorrow," she said, "she is not inheriting a company. She is signing her name across the money trail." I slipped Arthur's pocket watch into my coat. By morning, I was ready to let Constance believe she had won. The heavy marble floors of the Chatham County Courthouse echoed with the sharp sound of leather shoes. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall frosted windows, casting long gray shadows across the busy corridor. I stood near the heavy brass doors of the probate chamber, holding a paper cup of bitter, burnt coffee. My extended family clustered on the opposite side of the hall, whispering behind manicured hands and casting sideways glances in my direction. My aunt refused to meet my eyes, pulling her designer purse closer to her chest, as if I might reach out and steal her wallet. They all looked at me like a defeated man, a disgraced son crawling back to surrender his birthright. Constance floated down the hallway in a tailored black suit. She paused nearby, tilting her head with practiced, suffocating pity. She suggested we take a family photograph after the hearing, claiming it would show the community we were finally healing. My jaw tightened, and I focused my gaze on the wall. I did not respond. Leah handed me a leather folder. My attorney kept her voice remarkably low, blending with the ambient noise of the courthouse. She confirmed the emergency preservation order had locked the digital archives down, but the temporary receivership remained pending. A civil judge was reviewing Miriam Price's forensic declaration right now in a different building. We had no guarantee the receiver would be approved before my stepmother finalized her ownership and left the courtroom. We were walking a tightrope without a safety net, relying entirely on bureaucratic timing. The bailiff opened the heavy doors. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and dusty paper. The air conditioning rattled through the overhead vents, struggling against the thick humidity that always clung to Savannah in October. Constance settled gracefully into her chair across the aisle. The probate judge called the docket number, an older man completely uninterested in our bitter family dynamics. The estate lawyer stood up and summarized the settlement agreement for the court record. He specifically highlighted the attached disclosure appendix. The man clarified that this specific document was not a standard probate requirement, but a mutual condition negotiated between the parties to facilitate the transfer of the blocking shares. Constance requested permission to address the court. She stood and spoke in a trembling, measured voice. She claimed her only desire was to protect the jobs of her loyal employees and preserve Arthur's historic legacy. The widow swore under oath that she had never directly managed the prepaid funeral trusts, framing herself as a grieving wife, forced to clean up a tragic mess. The judge asked if she understood the settlement and the sworn disclosure. Constance smiled, a picture of perfect compliance. She confirmed she signed the appendix voluntarily, legally stating she held no hidden beneficial interests in any corporate vendors. I sat perfectly still, listening to her weave a fatal lie into the public record. We needed the trap to snap shut before she realized the bait was poisoned. Leah leaned toward my shoulder, her pen hovering over the thick stack of settlement documents. My attorney asked me one final time if I was absolutely certain about this path. Once my name hit that paper, my inheritance was gone forever. I reached into my coat pocket and wrapped my fingers around my father's gold pocket watch. The cold metal grounded me. I thought about the rusted cars parked outside Irene Brooks's house and the worn, yellowed receipt sitting on her kitchen table. I remembered the young teacher crying over a hostage urn. "Give it all to her," I said. I picked up the heavy brass pen and signed my name on the final page. The scratch of the pen sounded incredibly loud in my ears, echoing like a gavel striking wood. With those cursive strokes, I surrendered my inherited shares, my remaining claims against the estate, and my right to contest the settlement. The mansion had already been assigned to Constance under the preliminary distribution. What I gave her that morning was the blocking interest she needed to control and sell the company. I pushed the folder across the polished mahogany table. Constance did not hesitate. Her lawyer slid the paperwork toward her, and she signed the acceptance forms, officially taking possession of the shares and ratifying her fraudulent disclosure appendix. The judge stamped the cover sheet with a heavy thud. He formally approved the settlement within the strict parameters of the probate estate. He did not issue a criminal judgment, and he did not launch an investigation into the accounting discrepancies. The man simply recognized the transfer of assets and closed the file. On paper, Constance had won everything she ever wanted. The courtroom slowly began to empty. Constance walked over to my table, leaning close enough that I could smell her expensive floral perfume. A victorious smile stretched across her face, completely abandoning the grieving widow routine. She whispered that Arthur had ultimately chosen her because she possessed the vision to build an empire, while I only knew how to read spreadsheets. Before I could respond, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A uniformed court officer marched down the center aisle, carrying a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. He bypassed the judge entirely and stopped directly in front of Constance's defense attorney. The officer formally served the documents, stating they were from the Civil Enforcement Division. The lawyer frowned, breaking the crooked wax seal with his thumb. He pulled out a temporary restraining order, an asset preservation mandate, and a formal notice regarding an emergency receivership hearing. Attached to the very back of the legal packet was the sworn declaration from Miriam Price, along with a clear, color photocopy of a single page from the red ledger. I watched the attorney's eyes scan the page. He saw the massive unauthorized withdrawals, and then he read the name Evergreen Memorial Supply. Slowly, his gaze shifted to the signed disclosure appendix, where his client had just sworn she held no vendor interests. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His hands started to shake, rattling the thick papers in the quiet room. Constance noticed his panic, and her victorious smile finally fractured. The true shift in power did not happen in the courtroom. It happened 1 hour later, in the grand lobby of the Vale Memorial Group headquarters. I parked my car across the street, watching through the windshield as the rain began to fall. I could not go inside because I no longer owned a single share of the company. Marcus Hale, the court-appointed receiver, walked through the front doors, flanked by 2 independent forensic auditors. He did not ask for permission to enter. Marcus approached the reception desk and presented the temporary civil order to the facility manager. The document immediately stripped Constance of her banking authority, her data access, and her right to issue any payments to related vendors. Through the glass windows, I watched my stepmother rush into the lobby. She pointed at the auditors, demanding they leave. Constance still owned the estate on paper, but her assets were completely frozen. Marcus stood his ground. He informed the gathered staff that every financial decision now required his direct authorization. The employees looked from Marcus to Constance, realizing the reigning queen had just been locked out of her own treasury. She picked up a desk phone to make a call, but an auditor gently disconnected the line, explaining that all communication devices were now subject to evidence collection. The absolute control she had spent years building vanished in less than 5 minutes. Constance did not collapse or break down in tears. The woman was far too dangerous for a simple surrender. She marched out of the lobby and spoke directly to her pale attorney on the front steps. She aggressively pointed her finger in my direction, shouting loud enough for the passing pedestrians to hear. My stepmother declared that Eleanor Shaw and I had conspired to fabricate the red ledger out of pure spite. Her lawyer quickly gathered his composure and promised to contest the receivership in civil court. He announced they would immediately refer my name to the district attorney for corporate sabotage, heavily relying on the fact that my initials sat right next to the stolen money. The trap my father built had successfully cracked her armor, but it had not destroyed her yet. She was going to drag me down into the fire with her. I started my engine, preparing to drive back to Leah's office and plan our next defensive move. A dark sedan blocked my path before I could pull away from the curb. A man in a cheap gray suit stepped out and flashed an investigator's badge against my window. He asked me to voluntarily accompany him downtown to answer a few critical questions. I rolled the window down, the cold rain blowing against my face. The investigator placed a clear plastic folder on my dashboard. Inside was a printed wire authorization form directing $80,000 into a shell account. The document bore my exact electronic signature. That transfer was executed 8 months after your father fired you, the investigator said, his voice flat and accusing. If you were truly gone, Mr. Vale, why was your name still moving the money? The interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. Rain lashed against the single narrow window, blurring the city lights into smeared streaks of yellow. I sat across from the investigator, staring at the printed wire authorization he had just laid on the scratched metal table. My name sat at the bottom of the page, supposedly approving a massive transfer to Evergreen Memorial Supply, 8 months after my father fired me. Leah settled into the hard plastic chair beside mine. She did not look panicked, and she did not interrupt. The investigator tapped his pen against the paper. He asked me to explain exactly how my name ended up moving, stolen money while I was supposedly barred from the building. I kept my voice perfectly level. I explained that the company did not use physical signatures for vendor payouts. We utilized a digital batch process, which meant there was no personal security token or biometric scan required. Anyone with administrative access could pull up the old approval template and slap my initials onto a fresh invoice. Proving a digital forgery was incredibly difficult, but it was not impossible. Leah reached into her heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of certified documents. She slid my official human resources termination file across the table, followed by a set of bank signature cards. The banking records carried official stamps from 3 years ago. They proved unequivocally that my financial authority had been legally revoked the exact same week I left the company. The bank had physically removed my name from every legitimate operating account. Yet, my electronic initials remained active inside the internal accounting software. Constance had intentionally kept my digital profile alive, treating my identity like a bulletproof vest. If the regulatory agencies ever looked closely at the missing funds, they would find my name wrapped around every single theft. The investigator reviewed the bank cards in silence. He finally nodded, acknowledging that the physical timeline did not match the digital footprint. It was enough to stop him from placing me in handcuffs, but it did not fully clear my name. We needed someone from inside the building to break. Eleanor Shaw broke 2 days later. Our former controller agreed to a formal proffer session under the strict guidance of her own defense attorney. I was not permitted to sit in the main conference room during her sworn testimony. Instead, Leah and I waited in a cramped adjacent office, listening to the permitted segments of the transcript as the investigators reviewed her statements. Eleanor admitted to physically copying my electronic initials onto dozens of fraudulent wire transfers. Her voice cracked as she described Constance standing over her shoulder, directly ordering the falsifications. But the real devastation came when the investigator asked why she never went to my father. The controller confessed that Arthur actually discovered the altered codes months before he hired the forensic accountant. When my father first saw the massive discrepancies, he did not call the police. He ordered Eleanor to correct the records quietly. He told her to fix the spreadsheets without leaving a visible trail, hoping to solve the crisis behind closed doors. Eleanor tried to follow his instructions. She overwrote several files, thinking she was restoring the original data, but her panicked keystrokes only scrambled the digital timeline further. She inadvertently destroyed crucial metadata in her attempt to obey my father. I stood up and walked away from the connecting door, my stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. Arthur had actively compromised the chain of evidence just to avoid a public scandal. He had almost ruined the entire investigation before it even began. The case remained precarious until Marcus Hale, the civil receiver, finally gained total access to the corporate servers. The court-appointed official hired an independent forensic expert to pull a complete mirror image of the network. Leah called me late on a Tuesday evening, her tone sharp and focused. The forensic team had cross-referenced the creation dates of the forged approval documents with the building's security logs. The metadata proved that the fraudulent files bearing my name were created and edited exclusively from the workstation located inside Constance's private office. The timestamps matched her access card swipes perfectly, aligning directly with the shifts when Eleanor was not even in the building. Then, the technicians found the final, undeniable link. It was an archived email Constance had sent to Eleanor just days after my termination. Leah read the text over the phone, and every word felt like a physical strike. Constance had written, "Use the old approval format. Arthur recognizes it." That single sentence completely dismantled her defense. She could no longer claim ignorance, and she could no longer hide behind my stolen identity. We finally had the concrete evidence needed to prove the frame job, but the truth did not stop the public bleeding. Constance launched a massive counterattack the very next morning on local television. She stood on the steps of the county courthouse, wearing her dark mourning clothes, and spoke directly into the news cameras. She cried softly, wiping tears away with a white handkerchief. My stepmother claimed she was simply a grieving widow, fighting off a greedy stepson who was exploiting his father's death for financial gain. She publicly labeled me a thief, heavily implying that my name was tied to the missing funds. The public backlash hit immediately. Angry strangers shouted at me when I walked out of the grocery store. My phone filled with hateful messages from distant relatives demanding I leave Savannah. The community wanted a villain, and Constance served them a perfect, convenient target. Irene Brooks changed the narrative without speaking a single word in my defense. The elderly widow quietly provided her old, yellowed receipt to a trusted local journalist. The newspaper printed the document on the front page, showing the massive, fraudulent charge routed to Evergreen Memorial Supply. Irene did not go on television to scream, and she did not declare me innocent. She simply issued a brief statement, asking for a total, independent audit of the funeral home. Her absolute caution made her infinitely more credible than Constance's theatrical tears. The public began to ask questions, shifting their anger toward the missing money. While the city debated the scandal, Miriam Price uncovered another bitter truth hidden in the accounting files. The forensic accountant asked me to meet her at a quiet park near the river, handing me a manila folder as soon as I sat on the wooden bench. The autumn wind blew dead leaves across the grass. Inside the folder was a private memo Arthur had written 6 weeks before he finally contacted the regulatory authorities. He had drafted a detailed proposal outlining the sale of a massive piece of commercial real estate he owned privately. The memo explicitly stated his intention to dump his personal money directly into the depleted trust accounts to cover the shortfall. Miriam sat beside me, her bright yellow jacket standing out against the gray afternoon. She explained that Arthur had begged her to help him execute the quiet replacement. He wanted to fill the hole and pretend the theft never happened. Miriam had flatly refused. She told him that covering the stolen funds would instantly make him a legal accessory to the fraud, and she would not participate in a massive cover-up. I stared at my father's handwriting, feeling a deep, hollow ache in my chest. Arthur had not chosen justice immediately. When faced with the absolute truth of his wife's crimes, his first instinct was to buy her way out. He prioritized the pristine reputation of the Vale name over everything else. He only did the right thing because Miriam blocked his escape route. I had to sit there on the cold wooden bench and hold two painful truths at the exact same time. My father had actively tried to cover up the crime, but he had also eventually found the courage to stop. The wind picked up, rustling the papers in my hand. I tried to focus on the fact that the evidence stack was finally solidifying. We had the bank records, the server metadata, Eleanor's testimony, and the direct email. The frame job was falling apart, and Constance was running out of shadows to hide in. My phone buzzed, vibrating violently against the wooden slats of the bench. It was Marcus Hale. The receiver did not waste time on a greeting. His voice sounded strained, carrying a sudden, sharp urgency. Marcus and his audit team had just traced a massive outbound wire transfer from Evergreen Memorial Supply. The shell company had not just funneled money into my stepmother's real estate portfolio. A significant portion of the stolen funds had been redirected into a completely different account. It was a family trust account, and according to the newly discovered banking documents, the sole registered beneficiary of that stolen money was Patrick Vale. The cold air inside Leah Bennett's office felt suffocating. Marcus Hale had just dropped a massive bomb over the phone, claiming the stolen funds sat in a trust bearing my exact name. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, my knuckles turning white. My attorney remained calm, pulling a yellow pad from her drawer. Leah explained that being listed as a beneficiary did not instantly make me a criminal. The documents showed the Vale Family Legacy Trust had been opened using a separate employer identification number, bypassing my actual Social Security number entirely. A fabricated W-9 tax form sat buried in the application packet, bearing a forged signature. I stared at the cursive loops and stated clearly that I had never signed a single page. My lawyer tapped her pen against the desk. She pointed to the official notary log attached to the trust creation packet. The ink stamp claimed, "I sat in a Savannah office and executed the paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon exactly 3 years ago." I pulled out my phone, scrolling rapidly through my email history. I found the travel receipts and hotel confirmations from that exact date. I had been attending a funeral directors convention in Chicago, and my billing statement proved it. We possessed the physical alibi needed to shatter the notary forgery, but the structure of the lie remained terrifying. The money trail exposed the true architect of the elaborate trap. Miriam Price arrived an hour later, carrying a thick stack of federal tax transcripts. The forensic accountant spread the documents across the table. She explained that the fake trust received the stolen funds and immediately wired the cash into a private wealth management company controlled by my stepmother. The financial maneuver was carefully designed to use my identity as a protective shield while funneling the actual profit directly into Constance's pockets. Miriam placed a certified copy of Form 1041 right in the center of the table. The trust had filed annual tax returns under its separate identification number, falsely claiming zero distributable income. Because of that accounting lie, the government never issued a Schedule K-1 tax form to my address. The Internal Revenue Service transcripts proved I had never received a single tax notice or a single dollar from the stolen millions. The official trustee listed on the paperwork turned out to be a retired financial advisor living in Florida. The elderly man had simply signed the thick packets Constance mailed to him, assuming I had already approved the structure. A private tax preparer hired by the widow handled the filings, keeping the operation hidden. The trap was brilliantly constructed, but the architect was finally starting to panic. The investigative team called Leah the following morning, asking us to drive to the prosecutor's office. Eleanor Shaw sat in a soundproof interview room, clutching a plastic cup of water so tightly the sides dented. Her defense attorney sat beside her, nodding slowly at the lead investigator. Constance had just left a voice message on the controller's personal phone, requesting an urgent conversation. Under strict legal supervision, Eleanor dialed the widow's number, while the digital recording equipment silently captured every word on the secure server. The call connected on the second ring. Constance spoke in a soothing, measured tone, ignoring the massive corporate collapse happening around her. She gently suggested that if Eleanor remembered that Patrick created Evergreen Memorial Supply, the estate would generously cover her legal fees and protect her pension. The bribery attempt was naked, desperate, and perfectly recorded in a one-party consent state. Eleanor swallowed hard, her voice trembling slightly as she leaned closer to the microphone. The terrified woman asked what they would do about the old financial files still sitting on the corporate servers. "The dead cannot correct us," Constance replied, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Patrick can." The line went dead. The investigator stopped the recording, completely satisfied. We now possessed undeniable evidence of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. My stepmother had just locked the door to her own cage. Despite the evidence piling up against her, the woman completely refused to surrender. Later that afternoon, Constance demanded a private meeting through her defense counsel. We gathered in a neutral conference room downtown. The widow wore a pristine gray suit, projecting total confidence. She looked directly at me across the polished table and offered a new, desperate deal. She promised to return the family mansion and a substantial portion of the cash if I signed a sworn declaration stating Arthur had secretly managed the fraudulent trust before his death. She leaned forward, intentionally twisting the emotional knife. She calmly reminded me that my father had suspected me of theft 3 years ago, claiming nobody in Savannah would question his ultimate guilt if we blamed the dead man. Constance wanted me to sell out my father's memory to buy my own life back. I looked at the woman who had systematically dismantled my family and robbed our grieving clients. I did not raise my voice, and I did not threaten her with prison. I simply asked if she recognized the name Irene Brooks. Constance frowned, her perfectly arched eyebrows pulling together in genuine confusion. She had stolen thousands of dollars from the elderly widow, forcing the woman into humiliating debt just to bury her husband of 40 years. Yet, my stepmother could not even remember her name. She only saw numbers on a spreadsheet, entirely blind to the human grief she had manufactured for her own profit. I stood up from my chair, pushing it back against the wall. I told the widow to direct all future communication to my attorney, and I walked out of the conference room without looking back. The final pieces of the puzzle were locking into place, forming an inescapable picture of guilt. We returned to the accounting firm, where Miriam Price stood before a large, dry erase board. The forensic accountant methodically summarized the complete evidence stack, translating the complicated financial web into undeniable facts. The red ledger pointed directly to the stolen transactions. The independent bank records confirmed the money had actually moved. Corporate filings proved Evergreen Memorial Supply was a fabricated shell. Server metadata confirmed the forged approval documents originated entirely from the computer located inside Constance's private office. The devastating list continued to grow. Eleanor had provided sworn testimony, confirming the direct orders to falsify the accounting books. The missing funds were explicitly tied to real estate properties controlled exclusively by the widow. Finally, the notarized disclosure appendix signed in probate court, combined with the recorded phone call, proved she was actively lying and attempting to obstruct a federal investigation. I stared at the whiteboard, realizing the true brilliance of my father's final plan. There was no single, magical document that could win the war alone. The absolute strength of our case relied on the undeniable fact that every single piece of evidence pointed in the exact same direction. The tide of public opinion turned violently against her the very next day. Marcus Hale released his preliminary receivership report to the civil court. The document did not reveal any sensitive personal data, but it clearly outlined the massive structural fraud operating within the Vail Memorial Group. The regulatory agency began quietly notifying the victims by mail. The wealthy community of Savannah reacted with brutal speed. The prestigious country club formally suspended my stepmother's exclusive membership before noon. Her favorite charitable foundation voted to permanently remove her from their board of directors during an emergency afternoon session. I watched the evening news broadcast from my small living room, the television casting a blue light across the walls. A local reporter stood outside the funeral home headquarters, describing how Constance had been forced to leave the building through a rear service door to avoid the gathering crowd of angry clients. I did not open a bottle of champagne, and I did not celebrate. The victory felt heavy and exhausting. My stepmother had carefully designed me to be the perfect scapegoat, orchestrating my termination 3 years ago as a twisted insurance policy for her crimes. My phone rang, shattering the quiet atmosphere in my house. Dana Whitaker, the lead prosecutor handling the criminal referral, was on the line. The attorney delivered the news we had been waiting for all month. A grand jury had just reviewed the comprehensive evidence stack and officially approved a sweeping criminal indictment. Before I could even process the relief, my call waiting beeped loudly. I clicked over and heard the frantic voice of Marcus Hale. The court-appointed receiver had just executed a surprise search of the family mansion alongside local authorities. They had found the master bedroom completely empty. The heavy steel wall safe was standing wide open, and Constance's international passport was gone. The missing passport did not lead to a high-speed chase. Constance had simply driven to a distant cousin's house 2 counties over, convinced she had outsmarted the federal timeline. She believed she could hide until the media storm blew over. Her defense attorney finally shattered that delusion over a brief phone call. He informed the widow that the indictment was already unsealed, and federal marshals were currently preparing to kick down her relative's door. She surrendered quietly the following morning. I watched her walk into the federal courthouse, wearing a tailored navy suit and pearls, desperately clinging to the illusion of high society grace. The authorities did not parade her in handcuffs for the news cameras, but they did seize her passport and restrict her travel. Inside the prosecutor's office, Dana Whitaker handed me a thick binder. The lead attorney did not read off an endless list of legal statutes. Dana simply pointed to the major pillars of the indictment. They were charging my stepmother with wire fraud, theft from the prepaid trust accounts, and money laundering through Evergreen Memorial Supply. The charges also included falsification of corporate records, witness tampering for her recorded call to Eleanor, and perjury for signing the fake disclosure appendix. I ran my hand over the smooth paper. A profound sense of reality settled into my bones. The court was not going to punish her for breaking our family apart. The justice system was going to lock her in a cage strictly because of the undeniable paper trail her greed had left behind. The defense strategy materialized during the preliminary hearings, and it was brilliantly vicious. Her attorney stood before the judge and immediately blamed the dead man. He argued that Arthur was the true mastermind, the founder who controlled every single aspect of the company. The lawyer claimed Constance was merely an obedient wife, blindly signing documents under her husband's strict direction. They even weaponized Arthur's own confession video. The defense played the clip in open court, highlighting the exact moment my father admitted to delaying the investigation and trying to hide the missing funds. I sat in the gallery, listening to my father's legacy being torn apart. The lawyer described Arthur as a calculated criminal who used his younger wife as a convenient shield. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth, and a bitter taste coated my throat. But I did not ask the prosecutor to object. I refused to whitewash the truth to protect a shattered pedestal. Dana Whitaker dismantled the defense with clinical precision. The prosecutor projected the banking timeline onto a large screen, proving that the largest transfers occurred after Arthur had withdrawn from daily operations because of declining physical health. Nothing in the evidence suggested that he lacked the mental capacity to sign his legal instructions or record his statement. Dana then presented the property records, showing that the stolen money purchased assets controlled exclusively by Constance. Finally, she introduced the archived email directing Eleanor to use my old approval format. Its timestamp, server record, and surrounding messages connected the instruction directly to Constance. The dead man could no longer be used to carry the full weight of her decisions. A criminal trial would take years, draining the remaining assets and forcing the victims to relive their trauma on the witness stand. Dana called Leah and me into a private conference room to present a difficult alternative. The prosecution had officially offered a plea agreement. If Constance admitted to the core truth, forfeited her traced assets, and agreed to full restitution, they would recommend a sentence slightly below the maximum. Irene Brooks sat across from me at the heavy wooden table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Some of the younger families wanted a brutal, public trial. They wanted to see the widow bleed on television. Irene shook her head slowly, her white hair catching the fluorescent light. The elderly woman stated clearly that she wanted the stolen money returned to the grieving families while they were still alive to use it. She did not want to spend the next 3 years sitting in a cold courtroom, waiting for a theatrical victory that paid no bills. I looked at Irene, remembering the yellowed receipt sitting on her kitchen table. The decision was incredibly clear. I turned to Dana and agreed not to oppose the plea deal, provided one absolute condition was met. The official statement of facts had to explicitly name all 147 victims. The document had to detail exactly how Constance orchestrated the theft, ensuring she could never sell a sanitized version of history to her country club friends. I chose the quiet, practical return of the stolen money over the loud, violent spectacle of revenge. The sentencing hearing took place several months later, deep in the middle of a brutal Georgia summer. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Dozens of families filled the wooden benches, sitting shoulder to shoulder in absolute silence. Eleanor Shaw had already accepted a separate plea agreement weeks earlier, receiving a significantly lighter sentence and probation for her cooperation. Constance stood before the federal judge, wearing a simple gray dress that finally made her look her actual age. She read a prepared statement from a single sheet of paper. Her voice wavered perfectly as she highlighted her past charitable contributions and failing health. The woman offered a hollow apology that miraculously avoided taking direct responsibility for the ruined lives sitting right behind her. She still believed she was the ultimate victim of a tragic misunderstanding. The judge asked if anyone wished to provide a victim impact statement. I stood up and walked to the podium. I did not give a long, emotional speech about my stolen inheritance or my broken relationship with my father. I looked directly at the judge and repeated the exact question Irene Brooks had asked me in her small kitchen. I asked the court where her husband's money went. The federal judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the disgraced widow. He did not raise his voice, delivering the hammer blow with chilling calm. He sentenced the woman to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He ordered full restitution of $4,800,000. The judge approved the immediate forfeiture of the luxury real estate. Furthermore, the clean assets Constance inherited through the probate settlement were legally seized and slated for liquidation to make the victims whole. The court permanently banned her from managing financial accounts for the rest of her life. The bailiff stepped forward to escort the prisoner away. Constance paused at the edge of the defense table, turning to look at me one final time. The elegant facade had completely melted away, leaving only a bitter, hollow expression. "You went through all of this," Constance whispered, her voice carrying a sharp edge of genuine confusion. "And you still did not get the company back." I met her gaze, feeling lighter than I had in 3 years. The suffocating weight of my father's expectations was finally gone. "I never wanted the company," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I just wanted you to stop selling the same grief twice." The widow blinked, the reality of the moment finally crashing down. For her entire life, she believed wealth and property were the only true forms of leverage. She finally realized the assets she worshipped could no longer protect her. The bailiff placed a hand on her elbow, guiding her toward the side door. As she walked away, Constance did not look back at me. She stared out at the crowded benches, forced to meet the eyes of the 147 families she betrayed. There was no cheering in the courtroom, and no one clapped. The true satisfaction arrived in the absolute silence of accountability. The crowd slowly filtered out into the bright afternoon sun. Marcus Hale approached me near the empty jury box. The court-appointed receiver carried a thick leather binder under his arm. He explained that the federal audits were nearly complete, and a small, salvageable portion of the Vail Memorial Group could actually survive the liquidation process. Marcus stopped walking and looked at me carefully. He stated that the legal framework allowed me to officially petition the court to buy the remaining assets back. I had the industry experience, and the staff trusted me. I could reclaim the business and rebuild the empire my father had started. I turned my head and looked at the empty executive chair sitting behind the defense table. The polished wood gleamed under the courtroom lights, offering a familiar, intoxicating promise of power and legacy. Marcus waited patiently for my answer, holding the keys to the kingdom right in his hands. Marcus Hale closed his heavy leather binder. The court-appointed receiver stood in the quiet hallway outside the courtroom, explaining the mechanics of a legal buyout. He outlined exactly how the surviving branches of the funeral home could continue operating under new management. Leah Bennett stood beside him, nodding her agreement. My attorney stated there was absolutely no legal barrier preventing me from purchasing the remaining corporate assets with my own personal capital. I had decades of operational experience, and the remaining staff still trusted my leadership. I could reclaim my stolen seat and rebuild the empire. I walked past them, pushing open the heavy mahogany doors to Arthur's old executive suite. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wax. I stood behind the massive desk and slowly lowered myself into my father's heavy leather chair. For 3 long years, I had desperately wanted this specific piece of furniture back. I wanted the validation it represented, the final proof that I was worthy of his legacy. I sat there in the quiet room, waiting for the familiar feeling of my father finally choosing me over his own pride. The feeling never arrived. The leather was just cold skin, stretched over wood. The silence offered absolutely no approval, and I finally understood that waiting for a dead man's blessing was a terrible way to live. I called a general meeting the following morning. The surviving employees gathered in the main chapel, sitting awkwardly in the pews where mourners usually wept. Several funeral directors, who had remained entirely silent during my termination, stared firmly at the burgundy carpet. A few offered quiet apologies as I walked down the center aisle. I did not demand a public confession from any of them. The toxicity had flowed from the very top, poisoning the entire corporate structure. I stood near the altar and refused to take the executive title. Instead, I proposed a comprehensive employee ownership model, allowing the senior management team to purchase the surviving branches with strict, independent financial oversight. We established unbreakable rules right there in the empty chapel. Every single prepaid funeral fund would now sit in a completely separate, third-party banking institution. Independent auditors would review the ledgers every single quarter, and financial statements would be mailed directly to the clients. I agreed to serve as a temporary transition consultant for 6 months, guiding the structural shift, but I firmly rejected absolute control. I was breaking the crown, not wearing it. The true healing began slowly, measured out in legal checks and court-mandated wire transfers. Marcus and a designated restitution administrator initiated the first wave of victim payouts in late November. I drove back to the small, aging house on the edge of the county line. The morning air carried a sharp, biting winter chill. Irene Brooks opened her front door, pulling a thick, knitted shawl around her frail shoulders. I handed her a heavy paper envelope containing the initial restitution check, officially replacing the money she had borrowed from her daughter. The elderly widow held the paper carefully, but her eyes quickly moved to the second document in my hand. It was a certified copy of her husband's final account ledger. The fraudulent vendor charges were completely erased. Across the bottom of the page, stamped in bold black ink, were 3 crucial words: paid in full. Irene ran a wrinkled finger over the fresh ink. She told me the money mattered, but clearing her husband's name from a fake debt mattered infinitely more. We could not pay everyone back immediately, and the remaining families had to wait for Constance's luxury properties to liquidate. But the first genuine promise had been kept. The consequences rippled through the rest of the community with brutal efficiency. Eleanor Shaw faced the federal judge a week later. The former controller avoided a federal prison cell due to her early cooperation, but she did not walk away clean. The court ordered 3 years of strict home confinement and permanently stripped her professional accounting licenses. The judge also mandated hundreds of hours of community service, forcing her to teach basic financial literacy classes at a local community center. She would never manage another person's money as long as she lived. The wealthy social circles of Savannah moved quickly to erase their own shame. The prestigious charity foundation Constance had used to build her flawless public image was legally dissolved, and the remaining treasury funds were redirected straight into the victim restitution pool. The country club quietly removed her framed portrait from the grand hallway, replacing it with a blank landscape painting. Her high society legacy evaporated, leaving nothing but a cautionary tale. The living had faced their judgment, but I still had one final conversation waiting for me in the cold Georgia dirt. I drove to the historic cemetery on a quiet Sunday morning. Frost coated the dying grass, crunching loudly beneath my dress shoes. I stopped in front of the polished granite headstone, bearing the Vale family name. I reached into my heavy wool coat and pulled out Arthur's gold pocket watch. The metal felt heavy and freezing against my bare palm. I stared at the carved letters, and I did not offer him total forgiveness. I told the stone that he had done the right thing by preserving the evidence, but he had been a coward for making me pay the price for his silence. He had built an incredible empire on trust, only to let his own pride rot the foundation. I knelt on the frozen ground, hovering the watch over the damp earth, fully intending to bury the terrible memory forever. I stopped. I pulled my hand back and slipped the timepiece into my own pocket. I decided I would carry the watch, but I would never let its ticking dictate my choices again. Weeks later, I submitted the official historical summary for the newly restructured company. I included Arthur's name, listing his undeniable achievements right alongside his catastrophic failure to protect the clients. I refused to erase his existence, and I refused to worship him. He was simply a flawed man, documented in plain text. I never took the original Red Ledger home. The infamous book remained locked inside the Federal Evidence Depository, permanently cataloged as an instrument of fraud. The prosecutor allowed me to view it one last time before it went into deep storage. I stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of the evidence room, looking down at the faded cover. The pages filled with my forged initials, and Constance's cruel calculations no longer held any destructive power. The terrible numbers had simply become a reliable map, guiding the restitution checks back to the rightful owners. I did not sign my name on the cover, and I did not claim it as a dark family heirloom. I turned my back and walked out of the concrete building. The new employee-owned cooperative opened its first renovated location early the next spring. We completely removed the Vale family name from the large stone sign near the highway, replacing it with a title chosen by the staff. I stood in the background during the grand opening ceremony, wearing a simple gray suit. I did not cut the ceremonial ribbon. Irene Brooks held the large silver scissors, surrounded by the families who had finally been made whole. I gave Constance everything she demanded: the estate, the business, the name she had spent years stealing. She thought possession made her untouchable, but in the end, all it did was make every single lie hers to answer for. My father left me no empire worth keeping. He left me a choice, and for the first time in my life, I made it without asking whether he would approve. The applause faded, and the crowd slowly moved toward the reception hall. An older woman stepped away from the group and approached me near the entrance. She clutched a brand new pre-need funeral contract in her shaking hands. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a quiet, lingering terror, and asked if her life savings were truly safe this time. I did not place a hand over my heart. I did not promise her anything based on my personal honor or my family legacy. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase and handed her a printed guide showing exactly how to log into the independent bank portal and verify her separate trust account balance at any hour of the day. The truth did not live in a blind promise. The truth lived in the light. When you look back at Patrick's journey, the most profound lesson has absolutely nothing to do with financial revenge or clever legal maneuvers. We are conditioned from childhood to believe that family loyalty is an unbreakable law, and that our greatest achievement is inheriting the legacy our parents built. You are taught to protect the family name at all costs, keeping the dirty laundry safely hidden behind closed doors. But this story exposes the dangerous reality of blind loyalty. Sometimes, the inheritance waiting for you is not a blessing. Sometimes, it is a carefully constructed trap. You can spend years desperately craving the approval of a parent, bending over backward to prove your worth, only to realize they are willing to sacrifice your future just to protect their own pride. Arthur chose his comfort and his public image over his own son, and Constance simply weaponized that exact weakness. The hardest truth you can ever face is that the people meant to guide you might be the ones leading you right to the edge of a cliff. Patrick could have easily fought for the company. He could have taken the executive chair, hidden the financial crater, and spent the rest of his life managing his father's lies to protect his own wealth. If you have ever been entangled in a toxic family dynamic, you know exactly how tempting that path really is. It is incredibly easy to justify becoming the very thing that hurt you, simply because you believe you finally earned the crown. But true freedom does not come from winning a rigged game. True freedom comes from flipping the table entirely. Patrick realized that holding on to his family name meant carrying the crushing weight of 100 ruined families. He had to completely surrender what was rightfully his in order to finally dismantle the corruption. This brings us to the absolute core of the story. You cannot heal a broken system by using the same toxic methods that shattered it in the first place. Real power is not about possessing grand mansions, corner offices, or blocking corporate shares. It is the quiet, unwavering courage to walk away from a poisoned well. Walking away does not make you weak, and refusing to play the victim does not mean you have lost the war. When you force a manipulator to take full ownership of their own lies, you completely strip away their power. Transparency is the only actual cure for generational deceit. Patrick did not give the grieving families a hollow promise based on his personal honor. He gave them the independent tools to protect themselves, and that is what true leadership looks like. It takes an incredible amount of strength to stop seeking validation from a parent who will never actually give it to you. You have to decide what kind of legacy you want to leave behind. Think about your own life and the invisible expectations you carry every single day. Have you ever had to walk away from something you were rightfully owed, just to protect your own peace of mind and moral integrity? Have you ever realized that giving up the fight for a toxic family member's approval was actually your greatest victory? Share your experiences in the comments below, because walking away from the shadows is a journey no one should ever have to take alone.